Welcome to Noggin. This is a serious Noggin announcement. It's Mr. Benn Night.
Festive Road was being repaired. At number 52, Mr. Benn looked out of his window. "What a noise," he said. "I think I'll visit the costume shop." He put on his coat and hat and was soon at his front door. From there, on his way up the noisy street. It wasn't long before he left the noise and he was outside the shop. Mr. Benn went in. Inside the shop, Mr. Benn looked at the outfits that were there. He started to chuckle. Suddenly, as if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. "Hello, sir," he said. "Which one amuses you?" "The Roman one," said Mr. Benn. "Romans made good roads." "Ah, the Roman Gladiator," said the shopkeeper. "Why don't you try it, sir? You know the way." Still chuckling, Mr. Benn took the outfit and went through the door to the changing room. Inside the little room, Mr. Benn put on the Roman clothes and admired himself in the mirror. Then he went through the second door. Not the door back to the shop, but the door that went... Where this time, he wondered. He found himself in the countryside, among a group of people who were busily digging, carrying and constructing something. "Mr. Benn," said a voice. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Benn recognized the large man who had called him. "Smasher LeGroux," he said. "Fancy meeting you. What are you building?" "A road," said Smasher. "It will go straight to the city and the arena." Just then, there was a fanfare of trumpets. "Here comes the Emperor," said Smasher. "We always put on a little show for him." He blew a whistle. All work stopped. Then one man held up his thumb and another sighted an instrument at it. Smasher winked. "Lining up the road," he said. "It's the straightest road I've ever seen," thought Mr. Benn. "It keeps the Emperor entertained and we get a break." As the Emperor left, he called to Mr. Benn. "Gladiator, bring that big fellow to the arena. He should amuse us." "What does he mean?" asked Mr. Benn. "He collects men to fight the gladiators," said Smasher. "Now he wants me." I'd forgotten the gladiators fight, said Mr. Benn. Fighting is silly. And so say all of us, said Smasher. As they walked behind the Emperor, Mr. Benn got his first sight of the arena. It was the biggest building in the city. When they got there, Smasher was put with the other prisoners. Mr. Benn went into a room filled with worried-looking gladiators. "Hello," he said. "You don't look very happy. What's the problem?" "Because we're going to have to fight, of course," said a man. "If you're so worried about it, why fight?" asked Mr. Benn. "The Emperor," said the man. "We do as he says, or it's thumbs down." "Thumbs down?" Mr. Benn looked puzzled. "Look," said the man. "If the Emperor turns his thumb down, it means a squidging for someone. Thumbs up, they go free. Then there are the lions." "Lions? Squidging? How awful," said Mr. Benn. "Listen, I've an idea." After he'd explained the idea, he went to the prisoners. "You were right, Smasher," said Mr. Benn. "Nobody wants to fight, but I've got a plan." He explained his idea again and then said, "I need to hurry back to the road." Mr. Benn went back to the road and found the man with the sighting instrument. Then together they set off for the city. When they got there, Mr. Benn took the man to the arena. "You'll be up there, on top of the arena wall, opposite the Emperor, and where he can see you," said Mr. Benn. "You know what you have to do. I'm off to see the Emperor." The Emperor was about to go to his seat ready for the next show when Mr. Benn arrived. "The road is being built in your honor, O mighty Emperor," said Mr. Benn. "But to lead it straight to you, we need your help." He told the Emperor what he had to do. The Emperor smiled smugly. "I've seen the road being lined up. I know what to do," he said. Next, Mr. Benn took Smasher to the lions. "I see," he said. "Look, the Emperor is able to release the lions by pulling a lever by his seat." They go to the arena by this tunnel. "Come on, let's change the direction." Then he said, "I'm going to need your whistle as well." The changes were finished just before it was time to enter the arena. Instead of fighting, the two sides began a kind of football match. They chased each other and played all kinds of tricks to entertain the crowd. Sometimes they even kicked the ball. only the Emperor was unhappy. He wanted a squidging. When at last a prisoner fell, the Emperor prepared for a thumbs down. Immediately, Mr. Benn blew the whistle. The Emperor stiffened. Then, seeing the man on top of the wall, he smiled. Aha! Time to line up the road, he thought. He held his thumb up. The prisoner left the arena free. After that, whenever anyone fell, Mr. Benn blew his whistle. And the Emperor held up his thumb for freedom. Finally, the Emperor became furious. The lions! He roared. Let's have the lions! That was the signal for everyone to fall to the ground. Mr. Benn whistled, and up went the Emperor's thumb. The prisoners and gladiators cheered. Thanks to Mr. Benn, they were free. With a roar, the lions arrived. But because of the changes made by Mr. Benn and Smasher, not in the arena as expected. Instead, they appeared right beside the Emperor. That was when the crowd decided to go home. When last seen, the Emperor was still running. I like the way you made him put his thumb up, said Smasher. He lined up the road when I whistled, Mr. Benn winked. Smasher laughed. It's time I got back to that road. See you, Mr. Benn. Hope so, Smasher, said Mr. Benn. Good luck. Just then, a familiar voice called to Mr. Benn. This way, sir. The man pointed to a door. Mr. Benn went through the door and found himself back in the changing room. He put on his own clothes and then went back into the shop. As Mr. Benn returned the Roman clothes, the shopkeeper said, "You can keep the whistle as a souvenir, sir." Mr. Benn was delighted. At the door, he turned and waved. "Thank you again," he said. "See you soon, I hope." Festive Road was still noisy with the roadworks. When he got to his gate, Mr. Benn took out the whistle. I wonder, he thought. He gave a sharp blast. At once, there was silence. While the workers wondered what was going on, Mr. Benn slipped into his house unnoticed. What a nice souvenir, he thought.
watching Mr. Benn Night on Noggin.
On the pavement, in Festive Road, a group of children were playing cowboys and Indians. Number 52 is Mr. Benn's house. Mr. Benn was indoors reading a newspaper. He read that a cowboy film was showing at the cinema. Mr. Benn liked cowboy films, and he decided to go and see it. When he reached the cinema, he saw a long queue of people waiting to go in. What a crowd, thought Mr. Benn. I'll never get in to see the film. Never mind. I'll be a cowboy. I'll go to that special costume shop. Inside the shop, as if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. "Good morning, sir," he said. "You look as if you know which costume you want today." "Yes," said Mr. Benn. "The cowboy outfit." "Certainly, sir," said the shopkeeper. Mr. Benn took the outfit into the fitting room. Inside the room, he changed into the outfit. Looked at himself in the mirror as he usually did, and then went through the door that could lead to an adventure. Outside, Mr. Benn found himself in a rocky landscape. From behind a large pile of rocks, he could see little clouds of smoke. He went over to the pile of rocks, climbed up, and peeped over the top. The smoke was coming from a fire. A red Indian was waving a blanket so that the smoke from the fire made different patterns. Smoke signals, thought Mr. Benn, and he looked to see who the Indian was signaling to. In the distance, he saw a town of wooden houses. A cowboy town, thought Mr. Benn. I don't expect the Indian is signaling to them. Then he saw some more little clouds of smoke. They came from a group of Indian tents. Wigwams, the Indians called them. Mr. Benn decided to have a closer look. When he reached the village, he kept out of sight behind one of the wigwams. He could hear the sound of drums. Carefully, he looked to see what was happening. He saw a group of Indians dancing round a pole, a totem pole. The totem pole was carved and brightly painted. Mr. Benn looked at it carefully. It was the first one he'd ever seen.
Redskins will beat the Cowboys today. We'll beat the Cowboys today.
The Indians were shouting as they danced.
Redskins will beat the Cowboys today. We'll beat the Cowboys today. Redskins will beat the Cowboys today. Redskins.
A war dance,
beat the Cowboys
thought
today.
Mr. Benn.
Redskins,
I must warn the cowboys in the town.
Beat the Cowboys today. Redskins will beat the Cowboys today.
Nearby were some horses. Mr. Benn took one and rode off. In the town, Mr. Benn fired his gun to attract attention. The door of the jail opened, and the sheriff looked out. "Look out! The Indians are coming," called Mr. Benn. "They say they're going to beat you today." "We're ready," said the sheriff. "They will probably beat us. They always do. Still, it's a good game." "Game?" said Mr. Benn. "The hide-and-seek game, of course," said the sheriff. "Every week, the Indians play hide-and-seek with us cowboys. An Indian and a cowboy both hide. Then the Indian team looks for the cowboy, and the cowboy team looks for the Indian. The team to find the hider first wins. Every week, the same thing happens. The Indian vanishes, and we never find him. Sometimes the Indians don't find the cowboy, but even then it's only a draw. We never win." Just then, the Indians arrived. They smiled and waved and said they were ready to beat the cowboys again. "May I play?" asked Mr. Benn. "Sure," said the sheriff. "You can be the man to run off and hide." The two teams lined up opposite each other. At one end stood the Indian chief and the sheriff. They were the judges. At the other end stood Mr. Benn and the Indian who was going to hide. "Ready," called the sheriff. Both teams knelt down and closed their eyes. "Go," said the chief, and Mr. Benn and the Indian ran off to hide. The sheriff and the chief began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Mr. Benn peeped over the edge of the rock where he was hiding. In the sand below, he could see his own footprints. "Oh dear," he thought. "Anyone could follow those and find me easily. I must find somewhere else to hide." He looked around. Near the Indian village was a wood. Mr. Benn had an idea. He ran towards the wood, making sure that he was leaving a good trail of footprints for the Indians to follow. When he reached the wood, he climbed into a tree. Mr. Benn's idea was to cross the wood by moving from tree to tree along the branches, so that he wouldn't leave any footprints on the ground for the Indians to follow. When he reached the other side of the wood, he was very near the wigwams. The next part of the plan was to walk backwards to the wigwams with bare feet. Now it will look as if someone with bare feet has walked from the Indian village to the woods, he thought. The village is the last place they will look for me. Mr. Benn hid in one of the wigwams. Through a slit in the side, he could see the totem pole. It looked even taller than he remembered it. There were the heads, the animals, the fish, the large bird, and the Indian on top. The Indian on top? That wasn't there before. It was an Indian, all right. The Indian who was hiding from the cowboys.
95,
Back at the
96,
start,
97,
the counting
98,
had almost finished.
99,
100. The teams rushed off to find Mr. Benn and the Indian. The Indians easily followed Mr. Benn's footprints to the wood. But at the wood, it seemed that he had just disappeared. Meanwhile, the cowboys had followed the Indian to the village. But they just couldn't find him anywhere. Inside the wigwam, Mr. Benn had been busy. He tied a feather to the end of a long stick. Now he was ready to carry out his next plan. Suddenly, from above the cowboys, came a laugh. The cowboys looked up and shouted with delight. They had found the Indian. Then they saw the stick with the feather. And Mr. Benn came out of the wigwam. The sheriff said, "You tricked the Indians when you hid, and you found the hiding Indian. You won the game for us. Thanks to you, we won for the first time ever. You deserve a prize." And he gave Mr. Benn his badge. And when Mr. Benn asked the Indians if they would do their dance for him, even they were happy. Suddenly, a man appeared. He asked Mr. Benn to show him where he had hidden. Mr. Benn went back into the wigwam, and as he did so, he found himself back in the fitting room of the shop. Mr. Benn changed back into his own clothes. He went back into the shop and returned the cowboy outfit. "Thank you," he said to the shopkeeper. "May I keep the sheriff's badge?" "Of course you may, sir. You earned it," said the shopkeeper. Back in Festive Road, the children were now playing hide and seek. At his gate, Mr. Benn looked at the sheriff's badge. He wouldn't forget that game as long as he had the badge to remind him.
Stay tuned for more Mr. Benn Night. Up next.
An enchanting, entertaining, and magical experience. I loved it, and so did my kids. It's the perfect Christmas movie. Warner Brothers Pictures proudly presents Tom Hanks, The Polar Express, in cinemas everywhere now.
Look at tomorrow's weather.
It's your turn.
Okay then, come on. You'll feel right at home on a James Villa holiday. To find your ideal villa and discover how much you can save when you book direct, visit jamesvillas.co.uk or call 08700 50 50 99.
Hi, we're here.
And we've got something new to show you. It's got new dances, new songs, and new games. It's brand new episodes of your favourite Wiggles. Starts this Monday at 7:30 and 12 only on Nick Jr.
Thomas is playing a game with some of his friends. Can you help him? Who's this? Oh, Thomas, he's small and green. It must be Percy. Hello, Thomas. Whistle Percy. And who's this? He's big and red. Of course, it's James. Yes, it's me. Off, James. Now, who's this?
It's a steam engine.
It's Toby. Well done, Thomas. You found all of us. Find Thomas and Friends every day at 2:30 on Nick Jr.
Welcome back to Mr. Benn Night. Enjoy.
It was another quiet morning in Festive Road. At number 52, Mr. Benn thought he heard some laughter, and he looked out of his window. He saw Karen juggling with 3 balls. A boy balancing. Then he saw the group of children who were laughing. In the middle was Julian, wearing a funny mask. Mr. Benn watched for a while and then decided to go for a walk. Mr. Benn was on his way to the special costume shop, the shop which adventures could start from. Inside the shop, he stood and looked at the strange costumes and at once saw the one that made him laugh. As if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. "Good morning," he said. "Would you like to try on the clown suit, sir?" Mr. Benn said that he would love to, and taking the clown's clothes, he went to the door in the corner of the shop, the door of the fitting room. Once in the room, he changed from his own clothes. He didn't spend a long time looking at himself, but turned to the other door of the fitting room, the one which could lead to adventures. Mr. Benn walked through the door, wondering if he would come into a circus ring. To his surprise, he found himself in an open landscape beside a little car. He knew at once that the car was for him. It could only be a clown's car. Before long, Mr. Benn was driving the car gently along the road. Everything was going very smoothly until Mr. Benn was about to go round a bend. Then the car started to behave very oddly. At the same time, Mr. Benn could see a long line of trucks parked along the road in front of him, brightly painted circus trucks. There was just room for the clown's car to drive past. At the front of the queue of trucks stood all the circus people with their backs to Mr. Benn. The little car made such a din that everybody turned to look. The car stopped with a bang. And Mr. Benn fell out. Everybody laughed. They made Mr. Benn feel quite welcome, and they asked him to help them with the circus for a while. "If we ever get to the next town," said a voice, and everybody became quiet again and turned to look the other way. For the first time, Mr. Benn saw why they were all stopped. A bridge they should have crossed had fallen down, and they couldn't go on. The circus folk were beginning to argue about the bridge. The strong man wanted to fill the gap with huge stones. The others told him it would only stop the river flowing. The tightrope walker wanted to put a rope across and balance everything over. But they'd never manage with the elephants. The conjurer said that he could make pieces of wood and stones balance for them to cross, but nobody thought that that would be safe. Everybody was suggesting things which they did in their circus acts. The stilt man wanted to make extra long stilts for everyone, but that wouldn't get trucks or equipment across. "What do you think we should do?" asked the ringmaster. "Well," said Mr. Benn, "you all work together to make a good circus. Well, I think you should all work together to make a good bridge." They all agreed. When the wood started to arrive, the ringmaster asked how they should build it. "If we build it on the side, we can make sure it's strong enough," said Mr. Benn. "Then we can gradually slide it into place." "But surely," said the ringmaster, "it'll fall in the gap before it reaches the other side." "Build the bridge longer than we need it. The extra will balance it." The bridge was started and gradually began to be pushed across the gap. "It would be very useful to have someone on the other side to help it into place," said Mr. Benn. The circus cowboy, who did rope tricks, used his lasso. He threw it and fastened it onto the rock on the other side of the gap, pulled it tight, and fixed it. The tightrope walker had no trouble in getting across. Then the trapeze artist went over as well. All this time, more wood was being brought, and the bridge went on growing and growing. The stiltsman put on his longest stilts and stood down in the gap to help the bridge over. So the work went on building onto the road end of the bridge, and then everyone pushing the bridge further across. At last, it reached the other side. Everyone had played their part, and the bridge was a success. The first person to cross the bridge was Mr. Benn in his little car, still playing its tricks. Then came the whole circus procession. The trucks, the elephants, horses, everything. Once across the bridge, the procession continued happily to the next town, where they were going to put up the big top, the circus tent. The circus started with the Parade of the Stars. Mr. Benn, of course, drove his little car. The first act was a balancing act. Mr. Benn loved it when lots of things were balanced, one on top of the other. The second act was a magician who suddenly appeared. He looked very familiar, but Mr. Benn couldn't remember seeing him at the bridge. The magician made a ball disappear from under one box and appear under another. Then he held up a vase of flowers and made that completely vanish. Next, said the magician, I would like to make a real person vanish, and he asked for someone to help him. Mr. Benn drove into the ring. The audience laughed. The magician pointed to a large box. Step into there, sir, and you will vanish, he said. Mr. Benn stepped into the box. And just as he'd expected, he found that he'd stepped back into the changing room of the shop. He took a last look at himself in his clown's clothes and then changed back into his own things. Back in the shop, Mr. Benn returned the clothes. You're a good magician, he said to the shopkeeper. We can all do something, sir, smiled the man. Mr. Benn was about to go when he remembered he still had the red nose. I nearly forgot, he said. That's all right, sir, said the man. Perhaps you'd like to keep it. Thank you, said Mr. Benn. Back in Festive Road, everything was quiet with people going about their business. There was just one group of children balancing on stilts and laughing. At his door, Mr. Benn took the red nose from his pocket and thought of the shopkeeper. How kind, he thought. It's just what I needed to help me remember.
This is a serious Noggin announcement. It's Mr. Benn Night.
It was Saturday morning in Festive Road. Coal was being delivered, and boys were playing with wooden swords. Everything was very ordinary. This is an ordinary street. At number 52, the postman arrived with a letter. Number 52 is Mr. Benn's house, and Mr. Benn was at the front door to meet the postman. The letter was an invitation to a fancy dress party. Mr. Benn wasn't really very fond of parties, but he did like fancy dress. He put on his hat and coat and set out to search the shops for something special to wear. He tried the big shops, but didn't find anything. He tried the not-so-big shops, Still, he didn't find anything. He tried the small shops and the side streets. Everywhere, it was the same story. No fancy dress, only ordinary, everyday clothes. But at last, in a back lane, he found a little shop with all sorts of interesting things to wear. In the window was a suit of bright red armor. Mr. Benn went into the shop. As if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked. After looking quickly round the shop, Mr. Benn said, "I wonder if I might borrow that suit of red armor." The man seemed pleased. "Of course," he said. "Would you like to see if it fits?" And he pointed to the door of the fitting room. Mr. Benn carried the armor through the door and found he was in a small room. Quickly, he changed into the armor. He smiled at the red night reflected in the mirror. He laughed. Then he noticed another door. "Well," said Mr. Benn, and he walked through the second doorway. Instead of another room, Mr. Benn found himself in rocky countryside. From behind a large pile of rocks, he could see smoke rising. Feeling brave in his red armor, he walked over to see what was making the smoke. He climbed the rocks and found the smoke was coming from a dragon. Quite a large dragon. "Gosh," thought Mr. Benn, "somebody else in fancy dress." And he called down, "Hello, that's a good outfit. How do you make the smoke?" The dragon looked up. "You can't fool me," he said. "I know you've been sent to kill me." Kill him? Thought Mr. Benn. And he realized that it was a real dragon. A sad, very sad dragon. Before long, Mr. Benn was sitting down with the dragon, and the dragon told Mr. Benn his story. The dragon had lived happily in a castle. He worked hard, lighting fires for all the people who lived nearby. Everybody loved him, especially the king. One day, a man came to the castle with a new idea for lighting fires, which he called a match. Nobody wanted matches. They had a dragon to light their fires. But the matchmaker was cunning. He set fire to a barn or two and saw that the dragon got the blame. He caused so much trouble that the poor dragon was made to leave the castle. Then everybody had to go to the matchmaker and buy matches. To make matters worse, the king's favorite white horse had run away at the same time, and the dragon had been blamed for this as well. He was being blamed for everything. The dragon pointed to the horse which stood nearby. "I've been looking after him," said the dragon, "but I'm much too afraid to return him." "I'll help you," said Mr. Benn. "Show me where the castle is, and I'll tell the king the true story." The dragon was delighted, and they left almost at once. After they'd walked quite a way, the dragon stopped. There in the distance, Mr. Benn could see the castle. The dragon was afraid to go any closer. I'll wait here under the trees until you return, he said. Mr. Benn said, "Goodbye," and rode off towards the castle. At the castle, the guards saw Mr. Benn approaching. They rushed to the king and told him that a brave red knight must have killed the dragon because he was returning the white horse. Mr. Benn arrived at the castle. He didn't have to say anything. He was taken straight to the king to be rewarded. The king listened while Mr. Benn told him the dragon's story. The king had missed the dragon and was delighted to hear the truth. Nobody liked the nasty matchmaker. He was making his matches more and more expensive because he knew that people had to have them. The matchmaker was brought to the king. The king ordered him to prison until he thought how to punish the rascal. The guards took him to the deepest, darkest dungeon. Mr. Benn led the way for the king and his guard to welcome the dragon back. They stopped before they reached the dragon's hiding place in case they frightened the dragon. The king and the Red Knight walked to the trees. The king told the dragon how sorry he was for all the dragon's troubles and how happy he was to see him again. The dragon was so happy that he made Mr. Benn and the king ride on his back. With the dragon leading the way and the guard following, they returned to the castle. Everybody came to the castle to welcome the dragon back, and the king made a speech. He explained how the matchmaker had caused all the trouble, not the dragon. He said that matches were better for most people and that everyone could have the matches they needed free. The matchmaker would make the matches for nothing as his punishment. The dragon would be the king's personal firelighter. Then the king said they would have a feast, and the Red Knight would be the guest of honor. Everybody started to get things ready for the feast. Mr. Benn just stood at the side and watched.
A man appeared nearby.
And Mr. Benn wondered where he'd seen him before. "Would you like to change for the feast, sir?" the man asked. And he took Mr. Benn to a nearby door. "You'll find the other clothes inside, sir," he said. As he stepped through the door, Mr. Benn found he was back in the changing room of the shop.
He took a last look at the red night in the mirror.
And he changed into his own clothes again. Then he went back into the shop. Mr. Benn had had enough excitement. He didn't want to go to the fancy dress party now. "Thank you," he said to the shopkeeper as he gave back the armour. "I won't take it with me after all." The little man smiled. "Right you are, sir. Shall we be seeing you again?" "Oh, yes, I'll be back," said Mr. Benn from the door. "Very soon," he added. As he walked back down Festive Road, Mr. Benn thought about his adventure. When he went to get his front door key out, he found an unusual box of matches in his pocket. He smiled at the picture on the box. How nice, he thought. I'll keep them carefully, just to remind me.
Don't move a muscle. There's more from Mr. Benn after the break.
Look at tomorrow's weather.
It's your turn.
Okay then, come on.
You'll feel right at home on a James Villa holiday. To find your ideal villa and discover how much you can save when you book direct, visit jamesvillas.co.uk or call 08700 50 50 99.
Are you a homeowner who could benefit from an ocean finance loan? Perhaps by reducing your monthly outgoings by consolidating existing debts, home improving, or simply treating yourself to whatever you have in mind. Many already have.
Myself and the wife chose Ocean Finance because they were so helpful on the phone and understanding with the situation we were in at the time.
It was beginning to get to a stage where we were just working to pay bills and we wanted to be able to live a little bit.
They told you what you needed to know, not bubble you with science or whatever.
We found that Ocean Finance was the one that came up with the answers and didn't cause any complications.
Look for whoever you like, but before you've finished, give Ocean Finance a try.
Ocean consider all circumstances and rates are competitive. So for that homeowner loan of up to £100,000, call us now on 0800 916 9170 or apply online at oceanfinance.co.uk.
Hi, we're the Wiggles. And we've got something new to show you. Ooh, do you know what it could be? It's got new dances, new songs, new games, and it's for all of January. Have you guessed what it is yet? Yes, that's right. It's brand new episodes of your favourite Wiggles. Starts this Monday at 7:30 and 12 only on Nick Jr.
Would you like to dance like Angelina Ballerina? We can wear our pink tutus and our sparkly hairbands. It'd be such fun. Dance along with Angelina Ballerina every day at 4 on Nick Jr.
The adventure continues now with more from Mr. Benn.
Festive Road was quiet. There was nobody about at all. A van appeared. It stopped by the pavement and sounded a tune. At number 52, Mr. Benn looked out of his window. The street, which had been empty, was now alive with children. The van was an ice cream van, and the children queued for their ice creams. For a while, Mr. Benn watched. Then he went in from the window. By the time Mr. Benn came to his front door, wearing his hat and coat, the van had gone. Mr. Benn went for a walk. His walk took him to a special costume shop, a shop that adventures could start from. Inside the shop, as if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. "Good morning, sir," he said. "Which costume would you like to try today?" "This one," said Mr. Benn, and pointed to the white clothes of a cook. In no time, he had taken the outfit into the changing room. Mr. Benn changed into the cook's clothes and smiled at himself in the mirror. Then he went through the door that always led him to an adventure. Outside the door, Mr. Benn found himself beside some children. They were thin, and their clothes just rags. Mr. Benn was in a dingy back street. He walked along the street and saw other children just as poor as the first ones. After a while, Mr. Benn turned into a side street. In the street were other cooks, all talking about going to the palace. Mr. Benn followed them. The cooks walked past the palace guards. And through the palace doors. Finally, they came to a huge kitchen where other cooks were already busy. The king's servant spoke to the new cooks. "In the other room is the Princess Annabella. She will not eat. She just refuses. We want you to cook something that will make her want to eat. We've tried all these," and he pointed to food arranged on a table. "Now, get to work." Mr. Benn stood back and watched the other cooks. They fetched, poured, roasted, pounded, iced, boiled, and tasted for all they were worth. Each cook made his favorite food. As soon as one was ready, everyone would stop what they were doing. The cook was proudly led off, carrying his food. But before long, the cook, still carrying the food, would return, looking very sad, because the princess would not eat it. The others would go back to their fetching, pouring, roasting, pounding, icing, boiling, tasting, and so on, until another cook was ready to take his food to the princess. But the princess
did not eat it. On the table, the pile of food grew and grew and grew. But still the princess would not eat. As the next cook went in, Mr. Benn found a place where he could peep through into the other room. In the other room was a long table. At the far end of it sat a worried-looking king and a worried-looking queen, and a princess who didn't seem to be interested in anything. Then another cook came through the door. The king and the queen said things like, "Oh, how lovely. Doesn't that look nice, Annabella? Now eat up if you want to be beautiful like your mummy." After which Annabella said, "No." The king looked at the queen. The queen looked at the servant looked at the cook, and they all looked at Annabella. The cook picked up the food and carried it away. Back in the kitchen, the servant said, "What shall we do? We tried apples, bacon, cake, donuts, Easter eggs, fish fingers, and everything else we can think of. She just won't eat." There's nothing wrong with the food, said Mr. Benn. "I have an idea if the king will let me try it." The king didn't even wait to hear the idea. He said, "Yes, anything, just get her to eat." Mr. Benn ran out of the palace. Back in the kitchen, the cooks prepared more food and laid the long table for a feast, and then prepared even more food. Mr. Benn went back to the dingy street he'd seen before. He called the hungry children together and said, "You're all invited to a feast at the palace. Ask your parents if you can come and meet me back here." Later, Mr. Benn returned to the palace with the children. They passed through the palace entrance and along the corridors until they reached the room where the feast was. Mr. Benn said, "Children, help yourselves." They didn't have to be asked twice. After a while, a boy offered Annabella a plate of cakes. She took one.
She ate it. Then another. And then some jelly. And soon she was tucking into the food just like the other children. Mr. Benn's plan had worked. The princess turned to the king. "Daddy," she said, "can they come back again next week?" "Of course, dear," said the king. "They can come back every week." A man suddenly appeared beside Mr. Benn and said, "Would you take this back to the kitchen for me, please?" And he gave Mr. Benn a wooden spoon. Mr. Benn did as he was asked, but as he went through the door, instead of the kitchen, he found himself back in the changing room of the shop. He took a last look at himself as a cook and then changed. Back in the shop, Mr. Benn returned the cook's outfit. "What shall I do with this wooden spoon?" he asked. "You can keep that, sir," said the shopkeeper. "Thank you," said Mr. Benn. I hoped you'd say that." From the door, he waved goodbye. Back in Festive Road, the usual street things were going on. The children there didn't look hungry. At his gate, Mr. Benn remembered the wooden spoon in his pocket. He smiled and thought, "I'll keep it safely with my other souvenirs."
This is a serious Noggin announcement. It's Mr. Benn Night.
Above Festive Road, which is very ordinary and happy, clouds were drifting gently. In Festive Road, things were moving not quite so gently. Children were blowing up balloons, and instead of tying the ends, they were letting the balloons go, so they rushed about until all the air was out of them. At his gate, Mr. Benn stood and watched the games. Then he looked up at the clouds. How gentle and free they look, he thought. Then he thought that it was time that he paid another visit to that special costume shop, which his adventures could start from. He started to look around the shop when, as if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. "Good morning, sir," he said. "How nice to see you again. What would you like to try on today?" "What about this one?" said Mr. Benn. "Good," said the man. "See if it fits." and he looked towards the door of the fitting room in the corner of the shop. In the little room, Mr. Benn soon changed from his clothes into the other outfit. He stopped and admired himself in the mirror of the changing room. But not for long. He was too eager to go through the other door of the changing room. The door that would lead to... To what this time, wondered Mr. Benn. This time, Mr. Benn found he'd walked into a crowd of people. Wondering what the crowd was watching, he gradually managed to work his way to the front. There stood 6 balloons in a line. Very large, decorated balloons with baskets hanging underneath for people to stand in. The balloons had 2 men in each basket. But the one nearest to Mr. Benn had just 1 young man. So he asked the young man what was happening. "It's a balloon race," said the young man. "We're all going to race to the next town. I would love to win, but it's very difficult against a cheat." "Who cheats?" asked Mr. Benn. "Wicked Baron Bartram, the man with a tall hat in the next balloon." Mr. Benn asked why the young man was alone. "My friend suddenly had to go," said the young man. "I think Baron Bartram tricked him to make it more difficult for me." "Can I ride with you?" asked Mr. Benn. The young man was pleased, and Mr. Benn was soon in the basket of the balloon and was told how the balloon worked. "When we want to go up, we pull in the anchor. To come down, we let some of the gas out of the balloon from this tube at the bottom." Mr. Benn looked at the other balloons. Apart from the young man's and the Baron's, they all had extra bits on. One had 2 sails. The next had oars to row in the air. The third had a large kite to pull it. The fourth had a large propeller. "I couldn't afford any extra bits," said the young man. "Anyway, I don't trust Baron Bartram. I'm sure he's done something to the other balloon so that he can win." Just then, there was a shout from the man who was going to start the race. He held a pistol above his head. "What shall I do?" asked Mr. Benn. "When he fires the starting pistol, pull in the anchor rope," said the young man. "On your marks," called the starter. "Get set. Go!" Quickly, each balloon crew pulled in their anchor. Mr. Benn pulled his in. The balloon started to rise, then stopped. He looked over the side, and he noticed the balloon had been tied to the drain pipe of a cottage. "I'll bet that was Baron Bartram," he said. He gave a hard tug on the rope, and part of the drain pipe came up with the rope. "We'll return it later," said Mr. Benn. "It was the Baron, all right. Look at the other balloons. He's tried to stop us all." The first had lost one of its sails, and the balloon was spinning around in circles. On the second, Baron Bartram must have covered the oars with birdseed. The oars were lined with birds, so many that the balloon was weighed down by them. The kite was pulling the next one more up than along, and the balloon was vanishing into the clouds. On the fourth, Bartram must have turned the propeller back to front. The balloon shot off at speed, but in the wrong direction. Baron Bartram, grinning and waving, was drifting on his way. He became a bit annoyed when he saw that the young man was not so far behind as he'd expected him to be. The 2 balloons drifted on. The crowds were left behind, and they passed over open country. Slowly, they caught up Baron Bartram's balloon, and then passed it. Mr. Benn loved the gentle movement. This, he thought, is how the clouds must feel. They passed over a small wood, and then noticed that as Bartram was about to cross it, he lowered a rope. The man with Bartram raised a horn to his mouth and gave a blast on it. From out of the woods galloped a horse and rider. The rider grabbed the end of the rope and tied it to the saddle. Once the rope was fixed, the horse galloped off, pulling the balloon at a much faster pace. The young man and Mr. Benn had gone well ahead, but now they were being caught up again. As Bartram passed, he gave a wicked grin and called,
Bad luck. But you don't really think I'd let you win, do you?
The young man watched Bartram get ahead and said, There's nothing we can do now. Perhaps there is, said Mr. Benn, and he picked up the piece of drain pipe that had snapped off at the start of the race. He fixed one end of the pipe against the place where the gas could be let out and pointed the other end behind them. Some gas was let out, and the balloon shot forward and then slowed again. Again, said Mr. Benn. The only thing is, said the young man, as the gas is let out, we will go down as well as along. We've nearly caught them. Keep trying. An extra strong blast from the balloon sent it rushing along, but getting lower. They shot past the Baron and gave the horse a fright. It reared in the air, threw off the rider, and then rushed away, taking Baron Bartram's balloon in the wrong direction. Their troubles were over. The balloon was quite low, but it drifted along just above the trees. Finally, with a gentle bump, it landed at the finishing post to win the race. The crowd cheered loudly. The mayor presented the young man with a gold cup and the prize money. And then he looked for the medal for Mr. Benn for helping. I must have left it inside, he said. A man suddenly appeared beside Mr. Benn. I'll take you inside to get it. This way, sir. Mr. Benn stepped through the door and at once recognized the changing room of the shop. There were his own clothes. He took a last look at himself in the mirror and changed. Back in the shop, he gave back the clothes. Thank you, sir, said the shopkeeper. And then smiling, I believe this is yours. And he held out a medal to Mr. Benn. Mr. Benn was delighted. At the door, he waved and said, thank you. See you soon. Mr. Benn was quite happy to be back in Festive Road with his feet on the ground. The boys were still playing with balloons, which now were tied up and just drifting. At his door, Mr. Benn took another look at the medal. It had a picture of a balloon with a large number 1 on it. I'll keep it with my other souvenirs, he said. It'll help me remember.
Stay tuned for more Mr. Benn Night. Up next.
Get in the mix with Bob the Builder.
Hello, Bob's building yard.
We can fix it. You. We can fix it.
I mixed it.
You. We can fix it. Sophie to the rescue! Rock and roll! Bob the Builder, every day at 4:30 on Nick Jr. An enchanting, entertaining, and magical experience. I loved it, and so did my kids. It's the perfect Christmas movie. Warner Brothers Pictures proudly presents Tom Hanks, The Polar Express, in cinemas everywhere now.
Look at tomorrow's weather.
It's your turn.
Okay then, come on.
You'll feel right at home on a James Villa holiday. To find your ideal villa and discover how much you can save when you book direct, visit jamesvillas.co.uk or call 08700 50 50 99.
Let Noggin take you back in time to when children's programs were in their prime. Just think of marmalade sandwiches and Paddington doors. Mr. Benn shopkeeper who appeared from nowhere.
Which costume would you like to try today?
Underground, overground, wombling free. Bankless yawning, and those mice that say heave. Tune into your childhood once again by watching Noggin every night from 8 till 10. Welcome back to Mr. Benn Night. Enjoy!
In Festive Road, people were going about their business as usual. There was one group of children listening to the sound of the sea in seashells that they had brought back from their holidays. Number 52 is Mr. Benn's house, but there was no sign of Mr. Benn. He wasn't in his room, he wasn't in his garden, and he wasn't in the park. Mr. Benn was by the river. He was looking at the boats and thinking about the adventures that they have. It's time I had another adventure, he thought. Time I paid another visit to that special costume shop. Inside the shop, as if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. "Good morning, sir," he said. "What would you like to try today?" "Is that a frogman's underwater outfit?" said Mr. Benn. "Yes," said the shopkeeper. "Try it on." Mr. Benn took the outfit into the changing room. He quickly changed, and then he tried the special breathing tube that he had to use to swim underwater. Then he looked for the other door, the door that could lead to an adventure. On the other side of the door, Mr. Benn found himself among rocks beside the sea. He walked to the water's edge. Just as he was about to jump in, there was a shout. "Hey, what are you doing?" The shout came from some sailors on a red boat. An underwater boat, thought Mr. Benn. A submarine. The captain of the submarine shouted again. "We are going to look for a monster. If you see the green submarine, you can say that we shall see the monster first. Look out, we're going to dive. The crew climbed into the submarine. It slid into the water, floated away, and dived under the water. Mr. Benn was just about to jump into the water when there was another shout. Hey! What do you think you're doing? This time, Mr. Benn saw a green submarine. The captain shouted, "We are going to look for the monster. If you see the red submarine, you can say that we shall see the monster first. Look out, we're going to dive." Further along, Mr. Benn met an old sailor who said, "Hello, are you looking for the monster as well?" "I don't know anything about a monster," said Mr. Benn. "Tell me about it." "Oh, people say that there's a monster living in the water around here," the old sailor smiled. "The 2 submarines have come to take a photograph of it. They won't leave until one of them has seen it. It's a kind of race." "I see," said Mr. Benn. "Well, I'm not looking for any monster." And not wanting to waste any more time, he walked to the edge of the water and jumped in. Swimming beneath the water was like being in a different world. Mr. Benn was happy to swim about, just looking at the fish. He had forgotten about the submarines until he saw the red one nearby. A little later, he met the green submarine. "Those submarines are a nuisance," thought Mr. Benn, and he swam to the bottom of the sea to watch the creatures there. A seahorse, a dogfish, and all sorts of creatures. Just as he thought that he had seen everything, he saw a mermaid. She was holding something to her ear. "Hello," he said. "You're the first mermaid that I've ever seen. What are you doing?" "I'm looking for a new shell for our King Neptune, because it's his birthday today," she said. "Surely you can hear the sea without listening to it in a shell," he said. "It's not the sea I'm listening to," said the mermaid. "You listen." Mr. Benn put the shell to his ear. "It sounds like the wind," he said at last. "Yes," said the mermaid. "King Neptune has one that makes that sound." "Do you mean to say that you can hear different sounds in different shells?" "Oh, yes," the mermaid said. "King Neptune has a lot of shells with sounds of the wind, rain, birds, animals, all sorts of things." "That's fantastic," said Mr. Benn. "I'll help you search for a new one." Whenever Mr. Benn found a shell, it seemed that King Neptune already had it. Then he found an unusual striped shell that sounded like the buzzing of a bee. Mr. Benn was pleased because King Neptune didn't have that one. The mermaid was pleased too and asked Mr. Benn to come with her to King Neptune. Eventually, they came to King Neptune's cave. The king smiled when they said happy birthday to him, and he was delighted with the new shell. Beside King Neptune was a huge animal. Mr. Benn looked at the huge animal and asked the king, "Is that the monster that the submarines are looking for?" "Yes," said the king. "It's my pet monster. Those submarines are a nuisance. They frighten him. We can't go out because of them. I wish they would go away and leave us in peace." They all sat down. "Poor King Neptune," said the mermaid. "It's not a very nice birthday for him." "Can't you ask the submarines to go away?" she asked Mr. Benn. "Well, they won't go away until they have a photograph of the monster," said Mr. Benn. "I may be able to help. I've had an idea. I'll see you later." And he swam back to the shore. Once ashore, Mr. Benn soon found the green submarine. He asked the captain if he'd seen the monster yet. The captain said no, he hadn't. "You've probably frightened it away," said Mr. Benn. "Now, if you dressed up your submarine to look like a monster, it wouldn't be frightened and would come close enough for you to photograph it." The captain thought that was a good idea and told the crew to make a monster costume to cover the submarine. Then Mr. Benn went to the red submarine and said exactly the same thing to the captain. As soon as they were both gone, Mr. Benn swam back quickly to King Neptune's cave. Mr. Benn told King Neptune that the submarines were having a competition to photograph the monster. "I've played a little trick on the two submarines. Let's see if it works," he said. Mr. Benn led the way, and they hid behind a huge pile of rocks. "Now watch," said Mr. Benn. In the distance, they could see a monster. "That's really the red submarine in a monster outfit," said Mr. Benn. Another monster appeared. "That's the green submarine," said Mr. Benn. The two submarine monsters swam around, taking photographs of each other. Both the submarines thought they'd got a photograph of the monster and went off. King Neptune was delighted, and the monster gave Mr. Benn a ride back to the shore. At the water's edge, Mr. Benn waved goodbye and looked for the submarines. Sure enough, they soon came past. First the red one. When the captain saw Mr. Benn, he smiled and waved a photograph. Then the same thing happened with the green submarine. Suddenly, a man appeared on the rocks beside Mr. Benn and said, "Well, they both have their photographs. I think that you deserve a rest. Come into this cave and sit down." Mr. Benn walked into the cave and, just as he'd expected, found himself back in the changing room of the shop. He changed back into his own clothes. Mr. Benn returned the underwater outfit and thanked the shopkeeper, who said, "Look, there's a seashell stuck to this outfit, sir. Do you want to keep it?" "Thank you," said Mr. Benn. "It will make a good souvenir." Back in Festive Road, things were as busy as usual. There was one group of children saying happy birthday to a boy and looking at his presents. At his door, Mr. Benn stopped and listened to the seashell. He wasn't sure if it was the sea he could hear in the shell or the wind. Anyway, he said, "It's just the thing to help me remember."
You're watching Mr. Benn Night on Noggin.
Mr. Benn looked out of his window at number 52 Festive Road. It was a very ordinary street. Not a lot was happening. Mr. Leslie was showing some plants to Mr. John. Ladies were talking. And young Vicky was being scolded for chasing a cat. Mr. Benn smiled and decided to go for a walk. He went in from the window and soon appeared at the front door wearing his hat and coat. At first, Mr. Benn walked in the park at the end of the road. He sat for a while and watched the birds in the trees. And dogs who seemed to be taking their owners for walks. Next, among the shops, he looked in a pet shop window. Nearby was a florist's. Mr. Benn looked in there as well. As he walked on, he recognized the lane which he'd strolled into. It was the lane with the unusual costume shop, the shop which adventures could start from. He stood outside for a moment and then went in. As if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. "Good morning, sir. How good to see you again. Can I help you?" he asked. Mr. Benn looked around the shop. "Everything seems to have been animals and plants this morning," he said. "What's in keeping with that?" "How about this, sir?" asked the shopkeeper, and stepped over to a khaki-colored outfit. "A hunter?" asked Mr. Benn. "Not a bad idea. May I see if it fits?" He looked at the door of the fitting room and wondered if another adventure would start from there. Mr. Benn took the outfit and went into the fitting room. He was soon changed, and he looked at himself in the mirror. After Mr. Benn had admired himself in his new clothes, he looked for the door. Not the one that he'd come through, but the other door, which might lead to an adventure. Without waiting, Mr. Benn walked through. Outside the door, Mr. Benn found himself in an open space in the jungle. Nearby stood another man dressed like Mr. Benn. As soon as he saw Mr. Benn, he called out impatiently to him, "Ah, there you are. I suppose you're my new assistant. Now, come on, pick up my things and let's get started." Mr. Benn was worried by the hunter's gun and was determined to stop him shooting anything. But he did as he was told, and they started to walk through the jungle. As they walked, Mr. Benn's new companion did all the talking. He boasted and boasted how good he was at hunting and shooting. "You're very lucky to be with me," he said to Mr. Benn. "I must be the greatest big game hunter that ever lived. I'll show you." He took his rifle from Mr. Benn and pointed it at a little bird that sat nearby. Mr. Benn was quite worried for the bird and said, "Surely, if you're so good, you don't bother with little birds." "What? Oh, no, of course not," said the hunter. They walked on, and the hunter pretending that he hadn't really intended to shoot the bird. A little later, they saw a snake. As soon as Mr. Benn saw the hunter start to raise his rifle, he said, "I don't suppose you bother with snakes either." Laughed the hunter. "Certainly not. I was just trying the sights," he added. They walked on and came to a hill with a deer standing on it. "Now there is something to shoot," said the hunter. No, said Mr. Benn. "We'll find something larger in a minute." And he hurried the hunter away. For a while, they stood by a river. Mr. Benn was glad that the hunter was content to watch the fish without wanting to shoot them. Across the river, Mr. Benn saw a crocodile. "There's a crocodile over there, but let's wait for a larger animal," he said. The hunter never even started to raise his rifle. Next, it was a lion standing quietly outside its cave. "Not large enough," said Mr. Benn, and they left the lion in peace. After that, there was a giraffe. "Tall," said Mr. Benn, "but not really fat enough for the greatest big game hunter." "Perhaps not," said the hunter, and didn't bother to shoot. By now, both the hunter and Mr. Benn were hungry. They sat down in an open space to eat. While they were eating, a hippo wandered by. The hunter wanted to get his rifle. "Stop," called Mr. Benn. "I know that hippo is big, but he's not the biggest animal, and only the biggest is good enough for the greatest hunter." "Right," said the hunter, and they finished their lunch. The hunter wanted a little nap after lunch, and while he slept, Mr. Benn decided to have a stroll. He wanted to think. So far, he'd saved the animals, but how would it all end? As he walked, he felt the ground shake under his feet. The further he walked, the more it shook. In the end, it shook so much that Mr. Benn fell over. Then Mr. Benn could see a herd of elephants all shaking with fear. Mr. Benn managed to calm them enough to be able to stand up again. "You've saved the other animals, but we're the largest. We're certain to be shot, said one of the elephants. I've been thinking, said Mr. Benn. You've just helped me find the answer. Listen to my idea. The hunter was just waking as Mr. Benn arrived back and was eager to get on with the hunt. Mr. Benn led the way, and they marched deeper and deeper into the jungle. Mr. Benn pretending all the time to search for animals as he went. Came to a clearing and stopped. There stood the whole herd of elephants. Just the thing, said Mr. Benn. The largest animals for the greatest big game hunter. The hunter was delighted and raised his rifle, ready to shoot. At that moment, Mr. Benn sat down. That was the signal for the elephants. They jumped up and down for all they were worth. The ground shook and shook and shook. The hunter didn't have a chance. Every shot he fired went into the ground or into the air. Eventually, all his shots were fired, and the elephants, untouched, walked quietly away. Mr. Benn pretended to be disgusted. Call yourself a great hunter? If you can't hit a huge elephant, you can't hit anything. You're not safe with a rifle. Then, more kindly, he said, why don't you sell the rifle and buy a camera? At least if you missed, you'd still get a picture of something.